Tonight we're in Warrington. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Ken Clarke, former Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary, currently the nation's longest-serving MP and a regular contributor from the backbenches. Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, a former human rights barrister who stands in for Jeremy Corbyn at Prime Minister's Question Time, Emily Thornberry. Kate Andrews, Associate Director of the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Chief leader writer at The Observer and former advisor to Ed Miliband, Sonia Soda. And a comedian and broadcaster who combines comedy with economics and asks, is anything funny about Brexit? Guess we'll find out. Simon Evans. Welcome to our panel, to our audience here, and of course, you at home. You know you can argue along using hashtag BBCQT. On Twitter, on Facebook and on Instagram. Join in the conversation. Let's start with our first question tonight, which comes from Mahtab Khan.
Should Gavin Williamson be prosecuted for breaching the Official Secrets Act?
Well, this has, of course, been all over the papers and all over the news since Gavin Williamson, now the ex-Defence Secretary, was sacked yesterday. Emily Thornberry.
I think that there is, if there is sufficient evidence, then he should be. I don't think that it's a matter for the Prime Minister, actually. I think that it's a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service and for the police to see whether or not they have sufficient evidence, and if they do, yes, he should be prosecuted. Because the rule of law is something which applies to everybody equally, and whether you're a Cabinet Minister or whether you're not, you should be subject to the law. I have to say that I'm in this thing called, and I think probably you are too, Ken, the Privy Council, where we are, as a result of that, we have discussions with the security services, and we have things told to us in complete confidence. And frankly, if we're going to have a trust between politicians and the security services, then they need to know that we are not going to leak. I have to say that there have been times when I have had briefings and then I have been surprised to see them coming out into the press. I hope that this is actually not the end of it. I hope that it continues, because there have been other times, as I say, when I think that there have been leaks, and quite frankly, I think that in a way, with Theresa May saying that she's going to go, we have a number of leading Conservatives who are behaving in a completely irresponsible way, and you do not play games with national security, and you do not use it in order to try to further your political career. And we have to say enough is enough.
Of course, I should just point out that Gavin Williamson strenuously denies that he was responsible for the leak. Let's make that completely clear. Simon?
Well, from what you've just said, I think that's a very good point. I think probably from Gavin Williamson's point of view, he'd quite like to see himself prosecuted at this point, because he would quite like to have the chance to exonerate himself. And
well, yes, he said he'd
that won't happen unless he is confronted by a proper court of law. I mean, there have been various sort of comical memes on Twitter whereby he sets off on a sort of Tom Cruise-like adventure across 4 continents and with a trail of helicopters and grenades in an attempt to sort of track down the real leak. And I can quite see that this kind of fantasy unfolding in his head. But truthfully, he's only ever really going to be able to prove his innocence in that kind of scenario. I'm a little bit lost as to how Emily is able to position this as an attempt by Williamson to further his career and make a play for number 10, if that was the implication, because it certainly seems to have been a bit ham-fisted, if that was his intention. I would have thought
I'd say he was competent.
I think it's counter-indicative on that front. But, I mean, it's extraordinarily difficult for a member of the public, such as myself, with no access to the Privy Council or any of the sort of records of the meeting, to understand how they've come to the conclusion that he is the man. And it is certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that the Tory party in its current state will make a snap judgment and be seen to make some sort of decisive move to dismiss somebody and hope that a line can be drawn under that. I've seen too many examples of that recently without sufficient judgment going into the case for me to entirely trust them. So I think on that basis, from both people's point of view, I think a criminal case should be brought, and it would give Williamson an opportunity to quite potentially prove that he's not, at least beyond on the burden of proof, responsible for the leak. But then again, I have also seen certain journalists today explaining what leaks are like, and they are apparently a lot less sort of decisive and easily spotted to the layman than you might think. They tend to sort of, you know, come through in an almost osmotic sort of form rather than a simple sort of slip of paper or a brown envelope passed in the, you know, underneath the table in the pub.
But politicians know what they're doing.
Yeah.
When they're leaking, they know what they're doing, and the journalists know what they're doing. This is a game that both sides play, and you either do it or you don't do it. And I have made it a rule: I'd never ever do it, and I think that's a rule that everyone should have. It
probably is a very good rule. Gabby Hinsliff, who's just somebody I follow on Twitter, explained how easy it is for a journalist to let a politician believe that they already know this information. They're simply looking for confirmation so that they can make sure they don't slander that particular journalist. Whether or not Williamson would be naive to fall enough for that, I don't know. But
well, let's, Ken Clarke, actually, before I ask you, I just wanted to point out that you have just pipped into the lead for the person to have been on Question Time the most often in the whole history of the programme. Did you know that? 59 appearances.
It's my fate in life now that wherever I appear on a platform of any kind, people comment on my longevity.
Oh.
It's always
well, be pleased about it, I say.
What a splendid record. I sort of...
I mean,
59...
What's your view of this? I mean, are you comfortable that Gavin Williamson is getting a fair hearing, a fair trial, if you like?
Well, I am. I've been on the National Security Council, and I'm also quite used to the problem of leaking in government over the years, but is a terrible nuisance and has never been worse than it is at the moment. Yeah. The problem with the National Security Council is it only deals with those things, and there are some things which cannot go into the public domain, where you actually have a discussion where everybody is absolutely candid, candid about the balance of arguments, candid about what you think the motives of our allies are, all kinds of things, which you could not possibly have that discussion if it was suddenly going to appear on the front pages of the newspaper the following morning or any part of it.
But I'm making a slightly different point. If he didn't leak that pen, how does he prove his innocence?
Well, you have to rely on the investigation. It also means none of us are allowed to know what the evidence is against him. Almost certainly, it is not something they come out and give a press conference about.
I mean, he's called it a kangaroo court.
Wasn't. Well, he would, and I have every sympathy with Gavin personally. I don't think any of us are in a position to know why these people are so emphatic that it was him. I look at the people concerned. I mean, they're controversial figures, but the Prime Minister is a woman who would not. She has no motive for being biased in this. Cabinet Secretary is a responsible public servant, and I don't know, actually, whether it's based on things which you can then produce in a public court in a criminal investigation. So I'm afraid that's my strictly formal view. I think in this area we have to assume that this drastic step would not have been taken unless not only the Prime Minister but the Cabinet Secretary and the security people were satisfied that it was Gavin. I also hope
that's an interesting view, given obviously you were former Justice Secretary. Let's just hear from the audience a minute. The man in the glasses there.
Hi, so I don't know how many of you have seen Steven Spielberg's film last year called The Post, about the leakage of the Pentagon Papers.
To the Washington Post.
Yeah, it reversed to the Washington Post. So, the moral of that film seems to be that it was right for Ben Bradley to hit the button and print that day. So my question to you is, at what point does it become important for the British people, or in that case the American people, to know of a potentially damaging or dangerous occurrence that is going on high up in the government? And does that mean that the British population, or them deserving to know, is more important than the people in the government hiding it from the British people?
Kate.
Government has become so big and so powerful and so intrusive in our day-to-day lives. We've seen evidence over in the States of them spying on innocent people's phones without warrants. I mean, it is on our minds and in our homes and in our bedrooms and in our workplace all the time. And if something is going to affect the people of Britain or people in America, I think they really do deserve to know. I think we have to separate your excellent point, though, from whether or not Gavin Williamson should be prosecuted. And I think that's a very basic point. Ken says we're not in a position to know, and he's right. That's exactly the problem. It is he said versus she said. It is circumstantial. And there's this very basic point that if you are accused of lying or committing a criminal offense, you should have the opportunity to clear your name. I think that's something that we can all resonate with, the right to clear your name if you are found innocent. So I think it's actually very important that number 10 reverses its position, passes their so-called evidence on to the police. And if it is the case that he is guilty, that will come to fruition. But if it's the case that he's not, he deserves to clear his name, as we all would. That is right for everyone, including defense secretaries.
Sonia.
So I think this point from the gentleman in the front about public interest journalism and when leaks are in the public interest is a really important one. I would actually argue that it is in the public interest to know whether the Prime Minister is considering handing over a contract to help build our 5G network to a company like Huawei, a Chinese company that we know comes under the sphere of influence of the Chinese government.
It obviously says it doesn't.
It obviously says it doesn't, but there are lots of analysts out there who say that, you know, regardless of its ownership structure, there's absolutely no way that this company is going to be taking decisions completely outside of the orbit of the Chinese government. And there are Chinese laws that say that Chinese companies do have an obligation to help with state security. So I think it is in the public interest that we have this debate. I'm not sure why it's an issue for the National Security Council. I think it should be being had out in the open. That said, I don't think Gavin Williamson or whoever leaked this from the Cabinet, someone clearly did, from the National Security Council rather, has covered themselves in glory. I think if you're going to leak something in the public interest, the honourable thing to do, actually, is to say, I've got a problem with this, resign and take your concerns out in the open. That is the honourable thing to do. That is what honourable politicians have done in the past. We haven't seen honourable behaviour here by our politicians. But I would hate for the politics of this to distract from the real issue, which is, should we have security concerns about a company like Huawei getting a contract to build part of our 5G network? We know countries, our allies like Australia and New Zealand, have taken the decision to ban Huawei from sensitive national infrastructure, and I think that's probably the right decision. The last thing I will say is, taking a step back again from all this, is that it really shows the chaos that has beset Theresa May's government. We've got cabinet ministers leaking with impunity. I think we've got a cabinet that's more interested in running their own leadership bids rather than running the country. You know, the government is in chaos. Any notion of collective cabinet responsibility has completely disintegrated. You can't run a country like that. You can't run a country when you can't trust your cabinet ministers because they're leaking all over the place. It shows that Theresa May's got a massive, massive problem on her hands. She doesn't have the authority to run the country anymore.
Woman in the black top.
I think this is a really interesting debate, and I think there's a slight sideline to this about you mentioned honourable politicians and the profession of being in politics. We obviously have an issue with this particular subject, but when it comes to running campaigns and actually giving the public false information, nobody is held accountable, nobody is punished in any way, there's no legality associated with that, and yet we're expected to allow politicians to run our country having fed us what we discover to be false information. When is that going to change?
So how does that relate to leaks?
It relates to the issue because we come down so hard on this issue of leaks, but we don't come down very hard on politicians who provide us with false information. The best example, obviously, recently, I don't want to bring it to Brexit, the 350
we're going to get to Brexit in a minute, I suspect. We'll see how we go, but it's racing certainty.
But as an example, I think that, you know, when is this going to be addressed, and when are we going to be able to trust the people leading our country?
OK. Well, let me just hear from the woman at the back there. Yes.
How is Gavin Williamson meant to get a fair trial while it's all going out and everybody's going, she said, he said, these said? He's not going to get a fair trial, is he? So, at the end of the day...
Let me just hear one more point here from the man in the white shirt.
Personally, I think he's been stitched up, this bloke. I mean, he was a general in Her Majesty's forces. You don't get that if you know, a bit iffy.
When you say he was a general...
Yeah, he was a general.
Well, he was also... He was Defence Secretary.
Yeah,
he was a minister.
He was a minister, you know,
yeah,
I think...
Yeah,
well, let's not... We wouldn't go quite that far.
Right.
But anyway, you think he's been stitched up. I mean, let's...
Yeah, I think we're rather lading this leak with all kinds of dignified and public interest purposes. The fact was that they had a discussion in the National Security Council, and somebody got hold of the Daily Telegraph, gave them a blow-by-blow narrative of what everybody said, and it's perfectly obvious, it seems to me, that one of the 5 ministers who was on the losing side of the argument was trying to enhance his reputation, curry favour with the journalist, and weaken the force of the discussion. There was a hearing. All of the ministers cooperated with it, apart from Gavin, according to the Prime Minister's letter. He didn't cooperate fully.
Well, he says he did cooperate.
But anyway, there has been an inquiry, and this would not have been done if they hadn't been confident it was Gavin. The Hawaii thing is actually a far more important thing. The Americans are not going to leak to us all their internal discussions about what they're doing. The Chinese are not going to have ministers coming out and obligingly telling us all what, in fact, lies behind Hawaii. It's a difficult decision. The Americans are fighting a trade war with China. Hawaii has got a huge lead on 5G. There are obviously huge commercial and political reasons for trying to challenge this Chinese lead. There's also a really big problem, if you can't protect yourself against the danger, that Hawaii will allow itself to be used as an agent of the Chinese government. Now, this is a pretty complicated question. It's not even for a question time audience, dare I say. And it also, in the National Security Council, means I would need evidence on this. I would need our experts from GCHQ, the guys on our side who are engaged in this kind of thing. Somebody's got to listen to what they say is safe and is not. And I'm afraid the idea that the public have the right to know, and we should all have an opinion poll on it, and it should be decided, you know, down at the Dog and Duck, or even, probably no better, the House of Commons, this has to be handled securely. There are really a few things which, in the national interest, we have to do that.
OK. Lots of questions have come in tonight, so I'm going to move on. Before I do, I just wanted to say that Question Time comes from Northampton next week, and the week after that will be in Elgin, so call 0330 123 9988 if you'd like to be in the audience, or you can go to the Question Time website, of course, and follow the instructions there. Our next question tonight from Tom Frame.
If we end up with a customs union, have the politicians failed those who voted to leave the European Union?
Kate?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
A customs union means that the EU will continue to set UK taxes when the UK does not have a seat at the table. Tariffs are taxes. To think that that kind of power could still be in the hands of the EU when the UK has theoretically left means that I don't think Brexit will have been delivered in the way that, you know, you can debate whether we should have a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, but to allow that kind of power to sit within the EU when the UK is theoretically left means that Brexit has not occurred the way that it should have done. And unfortunately, politicians just don't seem to get it. I mean, this debate was nearly intolerable before the 29th of March, but now frustrations are naturally at an all-time high because they just don't get it.
OK, well, you've got one here next to you who supports the customs union. Emily, do you not get it?
But we had a referendum, and I campaigned to remain and lost, and have been over the last 3 years trying to keep the government honest, trying to keep us on a path whereby we look after jobs and we look after the economy, and that is really, really important. And I have to say that when that original referendum took place, I don't think that any of us appreciated just how complex the issue was going to be and how difficult it was going to be. But what we have been trying to do within the Labour Party is try to steer a course whereby, yes, we leave, But yeah, we don't go far. But in the end, half of our trade is with the European Union. The border in Northern Ireland depends on there being a soft border. We cannot play games with this. It is very important that we make the right decisions. Now, I think, actually, that we have now got ourselves into such a mess, and I appreciate that we have, that we really are going to find it very difficult to be able to get any further without going back to the British people and saying to them, this is the best thing that we can agree. It's not great. It's not perfect.
It's not Labour policy either.
No. It is Labour policy to go back to the people if there is a deal with this particular government. And if this government can get something through Parliament, I think it will be so controversial that in the end we will need to go back to the people and say to them, did you vote for this? Because if you did, fine. But if you didn't, then we should think again about remaining.
Listen, man in the audience there.
Do you not think that we're going round in circles again with this everlasting withdrawal argument? Do you not think it is time now for us to simply abandon this nonsense about the withdrawal agreements and say, as of May the 22nd, we are no longer in the EU, but we're perfectly prepared to have an amicable arrangement with all the European countries, enhance free trade, cooperate fully on the sensible things that we should be cooperating with, the law, security, etc. And, you know, but say it directly to the European heads of government. Waste no more time playing about with civil servants in Brussels who have a vested interest in being as awkward as possible. And don't forget, just 18 months, 2 years ago, they were talking about deliberately punishing us to deter others from doing likewise.
The woman there in the blue top. Yes, you.
I actually go back to the original question about MPs failing, people who voted, when there's MPs in Parliament now who, despite their constituency voting to remain, are still not representing them and backing the Prime Minister's deal and going for Brexit, when their job is to represent the constituency.
Sonia?
Well, I've only ever been on questions...
Since when were you called Sonia?
Sorry,
by all means.
I'm sorry. Just put two S's next to each other. Sorry,
well,
go ahead.
Sonia, go on.
So I completely understand why people are frustrated. We spent 3 years talking about Brexit and we don't seem to be any closer to a resolution. So if you're a voter, that's incredibly frustrating. However, there's a really thorny issue at the heart of Brexit, which gets to some of what the arguments that the gentleman in the blue jumper there were making and what Kate was making. The problem is there's no such thing as a clean break from the EU that respects the Good Friday Agreement, that keeps no border on the island of Ireland. Now, that's a really, really important insight that just didn't get talked about enough in the 2016 referendum campaign. The fact is, if we want to maintain no border in Ireland, and all sorts of people, both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, say how important that is to maintaining the Irish peace process. And, you know, the Good Friday Agreement is an international agreement to which Britain has signed up to. You just can't go ripping it up. The problem is, if we crash out with no deal, that is going to have really bad consequences for the Irish border. People like Kate say there are technological solutions that help us magic away the border. Well, they've had 3 years to come up with them. And the fact is, I'm
not sure Kate has said that,
because they
others might, but Kate actually hasn't today.
Others might, but people do say there are technological solutions who argue for a clean break, and the fact is no one's come up with them. So if we care about peace in Northern Ireland, we have to grapple with this real difficulty, which is you can't have a clean break from the EU and maintain no border.
So do we have to have a customs union? Because that's what
I think we have to have well, not even a customs union gets you there. You have to have regulatory alignment with the EU. And the problem is, when you get into that sort of territory, we become much more of a rule taker. We lose so much control compared to what we've got as a member of the European Union. So every option that maintains no border on the island of Ireland is really a second best option to membership of the European Union. And that is the fundamental problem at the heart of Brexit. And it's what our politicians weren't upfront with us about back in 2016.
Cannot possibly be the case that the only way for the UK to leave the EU is to have a system where the UK is still basically in the EU. And we know it isn't. You don't need to come up with a magical technological solution. A free trade deal based on mutual recognition could have got us there if politicians had decided to pursue that. But I'm deeply frustrated with this idea that, coming from the Labour Party, coming from others, that the first goal is a customs union so that the EU sets the UK's taxes. The second goal then is a second referendum. You can have as many referendums as you want as long as you respect the result each time and carry it through. This idea that it's more
So you'd be in favour of a second referendum then?
If the UK leaves the EU and in 10 years' time they want to rejoin, great. But this idea
Only
that you can pick and choose which results you respect and which ones you don't is ludicrous. And it's frustrating to hear from the Labour Party talking about maintaining jobs and security, because actually, the best part of the EU is the single market, and it keeps freedom of movement, and it respects immigrants in that way. And if the Labour Party were really sticking to its principles, it wouldn't be prioritising customs union, it'd be focused more on the single market.
Okay. Let's hear from the man in the blue sweater.
I just want to go back to Emily Thornberry's point about, on the original referendum, that the public didn't have the information we've got now. What I'm tired of, as a Leaver, is politicians telling me I didn't know what I was voting for. Yes, I did. I voted out.
Young man at the back there, yes.
The referendum itself was not on whether we would leave with a customs union or not a customs union. The referendum was in or out. So I can't see how politicians like Emery could have possibly failed when that was never on the table in the first place. This was a problem that we left without knowing what was the issue, and now the politicians are trying to do their best to solve what was, in essence, an unsolvable problem.
Well, that's what our problem is that we had a result of the referendum. It was very close, and practically half the country wanted to remain, half the country wanted to leave. But what has always been the abiding rule for me is I have to be a Democrat. I have to do what the public have told us, even though I don't think that it's actually in our country's interest to do it. But if the country decides that's what we should do, that's what we should do. But I will not let us. There are many ways in which we can continue to have a relationship with Europe, and I really don't think that it's in our interest to cut our nose off, to spite our face, to go sailing off into the mid-Atlantic and say we're having nothing more to do with Europe, when so many of our jobs and the jobs of our kids and our grandchildren depend on good relationships with Europe.
But you're not getting what you want, Emily, are you? Because you wrote, in fact, saying that you wanted a second referendum on any deal. And that's not happening. And you say that it's Labour policy to have a second referendum, but the draft campaign leaflet for the EU election didn't even mention it.
Well, we've got for the first time in our manifesto a commitment to that we will need to have a second referendum if there is a deal that goes through Parliament, and that we will need in the end probably to move on by way of going back to the people, and that is what's in our manifesto.
If changes can't be made to the deal.
That's right. So, okay, now, listen. People will say, oh, well, Labour's in talks with the Conservatives at the moment, but it may be that you'll be able to come forward with a deal. It may be. Don't hold your breath, because even if there is a deal, because there are still substantial differences between Labour and the Conservatives as to how it is that we should be leaving. But let's say Theresa May wakes up tomorrow morning and she goes, oh, I don't feel like Theresa May today, I'm actually going to compromise. I'm going to look at what it is that Labour's been saying and I'm going to agree to all of that. Well, great.
Or Jeremy Corbyn might agree with some of what she says. I mean, it takes two to tango.
But let's just go on this basis that they suddenly, the Tories now agree to what Labour is saying. The problem will then be, who is going to be negotiating that with Europe? Because it's not going to be Theresa May. Do you think Dominic Raab is going to be negotiating that in the same way? Do you think Boris Johnson will be? Because part of our problem is that even if the Conservatives
so that means a compromise deal is impossible.
I'm not saying it's impossible. What I'm saying is that we need to have some form of... We not only need to be able to have a compromise between the government and the opposition, we need to have real cast-iron guarantees that that is what is going to be achieved. Because at the moment, in the political agreement, there is what they call a spectrum of outcomes. What does that mean? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, we are going to be continuing to argue about this, but this is why I think that in the end we are going to have to admit as politicians that we have failed, that we have not been able to come up with an agreement, and that we need to come back to you guys and ask for your common sense.
OK. Simon, is the customs union a failure?
I've only ever appeared on Question Time once before. I think it was last September, and this precise question on Brexit was asked word for word exactly the same.
Oh, Simon, surely not. What are you trying to say? It's like Groundhog Day? No! I've only been on it since January. You talk about Brexit every week.
48 of Brexit, and it is taking longer to detach from Europe politically than it did geologically. It's absurd. All I can say is, you know, what can a layman add to this sort of ongoing debate? I tend to agree with Kate. I think the single market would be a better, you know, compromise than the customs union, but to be rule takers, obviously, is a worse deal than we had when we went in. I think Emily is being slightly disingenuous when she says that as politicians we have failed, whereas in reality what you've done is you've succeeded if you force a second referendum because you've succeeded in evidencing, in expressing the fact that it's impossible to deliver what was promised. Whereas in reality, I think it could be done if there was a sufficient consensus in Parliament to deliver it.
But we had the 350 million for the NHS yet.
In Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, of course, requires a soft border, and it's a calamity if that collapses. But the reality is that what people are afraid of there is that there will be a renewal of the troubles, of course, you know, civil unrest and so on, outbreaks of violence. And yet, any time there's any suggestion that the 17.5 million people who voted for Brexit threaten so much as a march on London, they are supposedly guilty of some sort of emotional blackmail to try and get their own way. And I think there's a little bit of double standards going on there, to be honest.
Hear what you say. Well, Ken, you put forward a motion, obviously, for a customs union. I've left you till last deliberately.
I've never been so quiet on Europe for so long in my life. No, the point about the customs union is the old common market, which nobody really complained about for about 45 years. It wasn't raised during the referendum campaign. Nobody said they desperately wanted lorry parks and customs officers at Dover. And I think it should, obviously, I see no advantage in abandoning it. Not imposed upon us by officials, agreed between 28 governments. Instead of having tariffs between each other all across Europe, we have a common tariff war round the outside. We've benefited from that for 45 years.
And what do you make of Jeremy Hunt's point that he said if we're proposing to sign for the customs union, I think there's a risk that you would lose more Conservative MPs than you would gain Labour MPs. So you would win the fight, but you'd lose the battle.
This idea that you just go and look at another opinion poll, I think you have to explain to Conservative MPs and others what it is the customs union is and what you're retaining.
Well, they must know by now.
It's not the most controversial element of all this. The exasperation, why don't we just leave with no deal? I understand that. That is impatience. None of us foresaw it to take 3 years for us to fail to solve the hundreds of difficult issues, but the 3 big ones for the withdrawal agreement and get out by now. But the exasperation I understand, but the idea that we're the only developed country in the world that just walks out and has absolutely no agreements with any other country in the world, apart from Switzerland, I think, on trade, flows of investment, policing, security, all the other things, I understand the impatience. It's not practical. The reason we've not left is that the hardline anti-Europeans in the Conservative Party, the party within a party, the ERG, refused to allow us to leave on the 22nd of March. They're the ones who are blocking the withdrawal agreement because of paranoid nonsense about the 29th of March, was it? Well, whenever it was. They've got paranoid fears
There've been a few,
about the Irish backstop. Now, I don't think the audience are frightfully bothered about the Irish backstop. I do think the point that we must actually...
Some people are saying, really? I think so. Well, let's ask the audience. Well, let's come to the audience, Ken.
Firstly, I agree that we don't break treaties. The idea that the Good Friday Agreement should be broken because we can't find an answer to it is just irresponsible, both for security, the economic welfare of both parts of Ireland and our relationships with the Republic of Ireland. And the idea that it's all a continental plot to trap us in the customs union is a weird argument. We could have left by now if it wasn't for the ERG blocking it. And although some of them have changed their minds, they got the Prime Minister to promise to resign. In exchange for that, all the candidates voted for it. But their followers didn't. And they're the reason that we're still in the European Union and not able to get on to all the other negotiations.
The DUP have played some part in that as well, obviously. Stung by your comment, Simon, about the fact that this question was asked earlier, before my 10-year-old question. I can take a few points from the audience and then I think I might move on. We'll see. The woman there.
Yes. Leave means leave. That's what I voted for and that is what I expected. all this prevaricating is just pathetic.
Sorry, I couldn't catch you there.
All the prevaricating is just ridiculous. It's going round and round in circles. Why don't we just break off, just leave, let it be done with that?
Because if you break all the
if
arrangements...
Ireland's a problem,
if
give
you
it
break
back
all
to
the
the
arrangements
Irish.
you
Let
have
them
now,
have it.
you have
they
to
don't want to
decide
be
what
part of
new
us anyway,
arrangements
and
you
neither do
have
the
in the
Scottish.
future.
So let the Scotland
You
go
have
as
to let
well.
people
I really
speak.
don't care. I just want out of this damn mess.
Yeah.
I think the no deal soundbite is just as bad as the second referendum. This is a complex problem that doesn't have a simple solution. And I think Labour's absolutely right to seek the sensible compromise. I think it's absolutely right to have the parties working together.
I'll take one final point. There's a woman back there. Yes, you.
Right. I think we're just going round and round in circles. I think politicians have been very good at just kicking the can down the road further with the second referendum. I think we have to accept that the country is divided roughly 50-50. So we have another referendum. Well, maybe this time the Remainers might just win, but then if you do some statistics in a different way, then you could actually prove still that it was to leave the EU. So, and we talk about money for the National Health Service. Well, we haven't left yet.
Right. Well, God forbid that we should be going round and round in circles on this panel. So I'm going to move on to our next question. Thank you for those contributions. Sarah Whiteside.
Good evening. Should rape victims be obliged to hand over their mobile phones in order to pursue their alleged assailant?
Now, this has come about, obviously, there's digital consent forms that are being introduced across England and Wales that will give police access to the phones of victims of all crimes, incidentally, but also people who allege rape. And there's been some controversy about this, as I'm sure you all know. Sonia.
I think this is a really difficult issue. I do have massive concerns about women who go to the police to report rape, having to hand over their mobile phone, having its entire contents downloaded onto police servers, and that being there for up to 100 years. Who knows what security the police have, who knows exactly what they're going to be looking through. We already know that there are big problems in this country about how the police go about investigating rape, how we prosecute rape. So, for example, we know that it's getting better, but we know that women, when they go to the police, they're sometimes still met with active disbelief when they go to the police to report a rape. We know there isn't enough professional support for women who go to report rape. And we know that rape is still very underreported because women are rightly scared about the trauma of going through a rape trial. It's an incredibly difficult thing to go through if you speak to victims of rape. And I think anything that makes it more difficult for women to come forward and report crime is really troubling. That said, I absolutely accept that, you know, defendants have a right to a fair trial. And if there is evidence on a mobile phone that's relevant to a rape case, then it's obviously completely right that the police investigate it and that perhaps it gets disclosed to the accused legal team. That doesn't mean, however, women having to hand over, you know, what is in effect, if you download the contents of an average mobile smartphone these days, generates, you know, millions of pages, A4 pages worth of data. And I think women are right to be concerned about their privacy and exactly how this is going to be used. So I think we have to balance a victim's right to privacy against a defendant's right to a fair trial. And we have to find some sort of proportionality. Yes, if there's evidence that's relevant on a phone, police should be able to access it.
Well, of course, they won't know it's relevant unless they look for it.
But they don't have to. We should not be getting into a situation where women are basically downloading the entire contents of their mobile phone forevermore. The result of that will be that more women will be worried about coming forward and reporting rape. It will get underreported and there will be more rapists that walk free, and that would be a terrible thing for our society.
Now, as soon as this question was asked by Sarah, a man at the back stuck his hand up instantly. So I just wonder what you have to say.
It's like you talk about women, but what about men as well? Because statistically, men, it happens to them as well. And the thing is, they're in the same position, but they're less likely to talk to people about it. We should encourage them to speak up. Absolutely. But it's like when there's evidence, men are less likely to be believed. So how is the evidence like going to change? It's like, what are you going to do to improve it?
Emily Thornberry.
You're absolutely right, and I'm so pleased you made that point, because it is right that if men are raped, they're embarrassed, they're scared, they're really worried that they're not going to be believed. There is, I mean, women have enough problems reporting rape. I agree with you. I think that men do as well. And you're absolutely right to keep raising that, and good for you. I'm really pleased you did, because I wasn't thinking of even raising it myself, so I'm glad that you reminded us. I think the point I want to make is this, is that rape is like almost any, I mean, like no other crime, in that what women fear when they report rape is that they go on trial as well. And so what we end up with is well, you know, she's this, she's a bad and this, that and the other, and looking into someone's lifestyle and so on. And then, you know, the man is and there are supposed to be rules before you intrude into a woman's private life. You're only supposed to be able to go into their background and the way that they behave and how many lovers they've had and all this sort of thing in particular circumstances. But I think the statistics show that, shockingly, about 30% of rape cases, the defence are allowed to go into the woman's background so that she ends up being on trial. And obviously the concern for women is that if you hand over your phone, and as you say, millions of pages will come off a smartphone, and if the defence are given disclosure of the prosecution evidence, which would mean that, you know, anything the prosecution have, they should hand over to the defence, there will be someone going through the millions of pages.
But then how
saying,
do you,
she likes this.
How do you avoid a case, Emily?
Look at the defendant.
But
He's
Emily,
like
how
that.
do you
She must
avoid a
have
case
consented.
like that of Liam Allen, who's been on the news just this week talking about this? I'm sure you're familiar with it. In January last year, the Metropolitan Police had to apologise to him. He'd been under investigation for nearly 2 years for rape, but he was acquitted when messages on his victims, alleged victims' phone were found. And he's been on the news this week saying if it wasn't for those messages being found and looked at, I would have been convicted.
I think that
so how do you avoid that?
So I think if a defendant says that me and this woman have been in correspondence and, you know, and it's been quite clear that she really fancies me and that she wants to have sex with me and da-da-da-da, then you can make that application, you can go to the Crown and you can say, this is our case. Now, you know, we think that there is this evidence on her phone, so in those circumstances, we should have access to those messages.
But only
I get
in
that,
those circumstances.
but you need to be able to establish, as part of your defence, why it is that it's relevant that a woman's phone is, you should have access to all the contents of a woman's phone. I think it's right to say that not enough women do come forward, and men, to make complaints about rape when they are raped. And I think, you know, part of the problem as well, looking at this question and around, is that there were initiatives a few years back to give women much more support, but with the cutbacks in the police and with the cutbacks on local authorities, there is not the support available to women who come forward and men who come forward and say that they've been raped in the same way that they used to have support. And it was like embryonic. We were just beginning to tip the balance and to make sure that complainants were given proper support, and it seems to be being cut back because, you know, because our system is just hanging together by threads.
Ken Clarke, as a former Justice Secretary, you support this idea? I mean, the CPS has come under criticism in the
You've got
past
to be careful
for the failure of cases for there not being sufficient disclosure.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing you've got to do is to make sure you're delivering justice to the victim and also to the accused, and to make sure that you're not wrongfully convicting somebody. You're only convicting people where there is no reasonable doubt that they're guilty. And because most rape victims know the person who they're accusing of rape. It's only a minority of cases where they're strangers. There has been contact between them. They know each other. And with the days of mobile phones, on a mobile phone, there can be things that are extremely relevant, like the most obvious case where the woman has been describing to her friends the person involved, the incident, in totally different terms to the one at later stage she's gone along and described to the police. Now,
but do you think it's right? No, Ken, hang on a second, though. Do you think it's... Wait a minute. Do you think it is right? Because it is reported, I mean, the BBC has reported, amongst other organisations, that the form that women and men are given says it if permission is refused to hand over information on the mobile phone, it may not be possible for the investigation or prosecution to continue. Do you think that's right?
That could be the case if the defence is that there was some continuing relationship and this is revenge, something, all of which obviously is almost certain to be revealed, not least by exchanges between the two people themselves on the mobile phone. But I do accept all the alarms expressed. It has to be stringently protected. I think women should be given an undertaking that it's not going to be kept on police records. If it's never, the whole thing's going to be expunged. That the only stuff that will be used from it and revealed to the defence is stuff stuff which the police can see is relevant, genuine to the arguments. I agree with Emily entirely. The woman's past love life is totally irrelevant. I thought we'd stop that being used in the courts. All that stuff is nonsense, and it just spins the case out. But I do feel that the real key is to have stringent rules about what is being done with this phone and ensure effectively that nobody has access to it who doesn't need to, and that none of it is going to be used or retained except that which turns out to be relevant to the case.
The man there in the check shirt.
I'm just wondering if it's indicative of the wider degradation of the justice system in the country. The Chief Super, I think it was, of Greater Manchester has said that they routinely screen out about 40% of 999 calls. There was somebody said recently as well, the last couple of days, that unless it's a slam dunk, as it were, if somebody has their bike stolen from their back garden, if there's no forensics, if there's no witness CCTV, they're not going to bother. You've got solicitors talking about striking because they're basically earning less than the national minimum wage doing their work.
Is this a response to cost cutting as opposed to
It
criticism over
does
failure of a
concern
number
me
of
that
cases?
it's almost like unless the information is provided to them and it's a slam dunk, and you can understand the pressures that the police and the CPS are under, that there isn't really any justice in wider society.
The man at the back.
I'd agree with the previous point that we already hear that the police are under-resourced, and therefore the blanket disclosure of information, it doesn't seem to me that they would have time to process that, and that will only undermine confidence further and make people less likely to come forward.
The woman here in the white top.
There's lots of information held on people's mobile phones, which is testimony to that person's character. Digitally strip searching that phone is not fair for any rape victim. Comparing it to another crime, if my house was burgled, I wouldn't expect the prosecution to ask me how many times I'd not locked my door.
Yeah. Kate.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that for this to be blanket policy is a huge breach of privacy for women. These cases should be determined based on the particular circumstances. We've already heard evidence from women that one woman gave over her phone, didn't get it back for 2 years. Another woman who's going by the name of Sarah, as to not expose her identity, told a story about how she was attacked by a stranger, and the police said, if you don't give us all of your mobile data, then we might not be able to prosecute this case. I mean, this is a huge breach of privacy, and in many circumstances, unnecessary. And I think that point's been made very well by Emily and Sonia as well. I do think there's an important point, though, here about what we're telling women and how honest we are with them. Because last year, only 3.8% of sexual offences were prosecuted. I mean, that is staggeringly low. And I don't think we're being honest with women about how they get the justice they deserve, or men either. Because if you think that you can go forward with these kinds of claims, and if you think you can do it without providing evidence, it's going to be an extremely uphill battle for you. And I think so often we've decided that trial by media, just putting the story out there, will be enough. But it's not enough for women and men. If someone has attacked you in that way, you want to see justice. So while I don't believe in any way that this breach of privacy should go ahead in many circumstances, we need to be much more honest with women and men about how they get these prosecutions and how they find justice. Because I fear that sometimes we say, simply saying it will be enough, simply telling your story will be enough. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. We believe in innocent till proven guilty. You have to go to court, and if you have that evidence, it will help you.
Simon.
Yeah, I don't know that there's an awful lot left to say. I'd agree with Ken. I think the distinction has to be drawn between what is correct and appropriate evidence to be presented in court in support or indeed in defence, and the means by which that evidence is gained. I think a mobile phone in today's world is obviously going to be an extraordinarily crucial opportunity to find evidence, and a victim might very well find that they have a much stronger case and a more solid and successful case as a result of the evidence that's on there, because obviously traditionally the whole problem with rape has been a genuine he said, she said conundrum, unlike the one that I think we were presented with earlier with Williamson. So, as Kate said, it seems to me, having read into it in the way the news was reported this week, it seems that most of the people who have found this unpleasant and unwelcome in their own cases, have mainly been concerned about the stress of handing over your phone and then the waiting for it to come back and so on. Rather than
and the invasion of privacy.
The invasion of privacy to a large extent.
Invasion of privacy.
Well, I accept it, certainly, but the evidence that I saw in the stories was, like, as Kate mentioned, a phone which went for 2 years. Well, that's obviously unacceptable.
No, I think, in fact, I think, well, certainly what I've seen has been primarily about invasion of privacy.
Okay.
So.
Well, I accept invasion of privacy is obviously a concern. I think if you do have to confront the fact that if you want the best possible chance for a rape case to be successful, then the more evidence you can gather, which demonstrates the events, the sequence in which they took place and so on, that are available to the police in order to bring a prosecution, is likely to do that. And I agree with, I think other people have said, it's a matter of communicating that fact and what the motives are to the victim in order for them to understand that by helping to corroborate their story with their own evidence, they are more likely to secure a prosecution.
We haven't got a lot of time left in the programme, but I do want to try and squeeze one more question from Will Oliver.
Why would we trust the Tories to tackle climate change when in 9 years of government they've cut subsidies for renewables, supported the expansion of Heathrow Airport and funded fracking across the whole of Lancashire?
Of course, one fracking site is about 50 miles from here in Warrington. Ken Clarke, why should anyone trust the Tories on climate change?
Well, we've got the best record of any G20 country, I think, in cutting carbon emissions, and we are far ahead of most other developed countries. Unfortunately, some not doing it at all. But I quite accept that we need to do more, so does the government. And the problem is going to be, firstly, working out what is practical and what works, what is deliverable, and secondly, overcoming public resistance to anything that actually damages them.
Well, a report came out today, which was requested by the government, which said that the UK should cut greenhouse gases to nearly zero by 2050. And a number of ways of doing that were suggested: planting 3 billion trees, converting a fifth of farmland into forest, turning our heat thermostats down to 19 degrees centigrade in winter. Are any of these things going to be done? Do you think they're sensible?
Yeah, I think so. John Gummer's the chairman of that. He's always been he's an expert, advocate of these things, and I think the government's going to have to adopt them. The public are going to find it very difficult talking about getting rid of all gas and diesel cars, not in 5 years' time, but by 2035, earlier if possible, and getting rid of all our gas boiler heating in houses. The public... that you do, firstly, you've got to make sure you don't do vast economic damage as you do practical things that work, and there is often public resistance. I introduced a landfill tax, encouraged by John Gummer. He was Environment Secretary. That was all right. Airport passenger tax I introduced. That's never been overwhelmingly popular, though it obviously should be increased because of the climate change problems that we have. I introduced a fuel tax escalator. I don't remember getting phrases for that. So as we're all now realising...
So hard done by Ken.
But it get even worse. Some things we're going to have to do, as are being argued, are going to be much more difficult than that. And lots of people cheer on demonstrators, saying the politicians have let us down, let's take action now. And you tell them that their diesel cars got to go, and they're furious with the damn politicians who don't understand all their fuel tax has got to go up. Good heavens. No, you mustn't do that. So that's what causes other governments to hold back. Of course, we've got a long way to go. Almost impossible to find a government that's got a better record than the British one. And now the public mood is changing. We're all waking up to the emergency. Our young people
I've got to ask you brief because we haven't got a lot of time left.
The government will go as fast as you'll let them go.
Briefly, everybody else. Sonia.
Will, I've got a simple answer to your question. You shouldn't trust the Tories on climate change. David Cameron, in opposition, promised that the Conservatives would be the greenest government ever. And actually, from 2010 to 2015, you did see some pretty good policies around climate change. However, since 2015, since you didn't have the Lib Dems in government to keep the Tories honest, you've seen a dizzying number of U-turns on climate policy. Fracking was one thing that Will mentioned. I can't believe that the day after Parliament declared a climate emergency, we're still talking about whether we should frack in this country. Of course we shouldn't. Frack gas, the emissions it gives off, is worse than burning coal. There's been U-turns on the zero carbon home standard, on investment in carbon capture storage. The UK is now on track to miss its next set of legally binding binding targets on carbon reduction. This is not a government that's committed to climate change. It will sacrifice climate change policies on the altar of austerity and a bonfire of the regulations. We're not going to crack this without state intervention. The Tories are not the party to do it.
We all want a cleaner and greener planet, there's no doubt about it, but there are trade-offs. We could cut many, many, many carbon emissions overnight, but we would be poorer and more deprived and worse off. Ken just mentioned all of the taxes that he's already brought in. If you actually wanted to slash carbon emissions in the way that the Extinction Rebellion is calling for to do so overnight, there would be real pain.
Kate, the question is briefly, should anyone trust the Tories to sort out, to meet the carbon emissions?
I don't trust any politician or government who says they're going to fix this. The reality is that when we have green energy that is sustainable, that we can all use it, which we're all striving for, it will be because some young woman off her own back through free enterprise made that possible in her garage, figuring out a way to make wind farms and solar panels efficient. It will not be some Whitehall bureaucrat. And until we accept that actually capitalism and free markets are going to make us greener in the future, I think that all of the comments from Labour and Tory alike are actually really quite meaningless because it's not government that's going to get us there.
Simon.
I have a lot of sympathy with what Ken was saying, to be honest. I'm sure it's a universal thing in all countries, particularly in this country, that we blame the government for never introducing the policies which we, of course, never reward adequately when they do come in. It does cause pain, these sort of things. I tend to agree with Kate also that technology is more likely to get us out of this hole than sort of returning to some sort of hippie paradise or Unabomber manifesto version of the future. I honestly think, I mean, I'm not sure about a woman in a garage, but certainly, you know, huge German scientific industrial complexes such as Siemens, who have brought down the price of photovoltaic cells and the extraordinarily decreased prices of lithium batteries in electric cars and so on. There is an extraordinary amount to be actually quite cheerful about in terms of the technology that's being brought to bear on this problem. And I do think actually, you know, a degree of excitement and optimism, it can be every bit as powerful a force for good as hand-wringing and camping out on Westminster Bridge overnight.
I'm not sure anyone's suggesting a Unabomber manifesto or hippie paradise, but I guess someone could. Clearly, you don't think the government's are the right people to sort it out. Would Labour do any better?
I think what needs to be done is we need to put forward the arguments and we need to bring the public with us. That's absolutely right. And I think there are a number of things that the public would come with us on. I think that, for example, we need to be doing much more work in terms of insulating people's houses and saying to them, you know, if we can get your house insulated, and yes, it can be subsidised, and yes, you won't be using as much gas or electricity to heat your homes, and your bills will be lower, you know, that is something that people will go with. I think more people would be, next time they bought a car, would think about buying an electric car if we could really see some power points around the place so that we could get our cars recharged. I think that there are ways in which the government can go forward. I think there are a number of new forms of renewable energy that there is simply not the investment in. But the one thing that the government, I mean, there are many things, I think, and I won't go through them again, the ways in which the government has failed, but the one way in which they have failed is that they've not been talking about this issue and they have not been putting it forward as the most important issue. Because guess what? This is even more important than Brexit.
And on that note...
March before the Labour Party would talk about the subject.
And on that note, more important than Brexit. Lots of you got your hands up. Forgive me because our hour is up, I'm afraid. Our next programme is in Northampton, where we'll be joined by Anna Soubry from Change UK and, of course, by voices in support of Brexit ahead of the European elections. They should be interesting. And then the following week, we'll be in Elgin. So call 0330 123 9988. If you'd like to be in the audience, you can go to the Question Time website. Of course, you can follow the instructions there. And if you want to have your say on tonight's topics, you can join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time, Extra Time. That's on 5 Live now. And if you're really up for more, keep watching, because Hugh Edwards and the local council election results special is on straight after this. Are you expecting a trouncing, Ken? We shall see how that's going to go.
I feel sorry for our councillors. I don't think a trouncing. I think people do distinguish between local government and the shambles in Westminster.
Well, we shall see. We shall see how it turns out. For now, thank you very much to my panel, to the audience here for coming tonight, and, of course, to you at home for watching from Warrington. Bye-bye.
So, as Fiona mentioned, voting in the local elections for England and Northern Ireland is over, and as the votes are counted, Hugh Edwards has your through-the-night coverage here on BBC One. Election 2019, next.
It's almost here.
How cruel is that?
The journey has been tough for Man City and West Ham.
are going to Wembley.
The time has come to fight for the badge as the crowd roars them on to glory. Who will reign supreme and get their name on the cup? The Women's FA Cup final, live Saturday at 5:10 on BBC One and BBC iPlayer.
It just feels so horribly overwhelming, just being a mum and the responsibility you have of raising a little human.
She showed her love in slightly odd ways. She was not good at expressing emotions.
They must have been some of the most spectacular sights in the history of the solar system.
Louis Theroux, Mothers on the Edge, Sunday 12th of May on BBC Two and BBC iPlayer.
So let's see how things pan out throughout the night now on BBC One. Hugh Edwards has coverage of election 2019 right through until 6 o'clock, live.
We're in the most turbulent period in British politics since the Second World War. The votes are being counted in hundreds of local councils.